So for the past few weeks, we've been following in the footsteps of Jesus through the Gospel of Mark. And thus far, we've witnessed Jesus' baptism in Mark chapter 1. We've seen a man lowered through the ceiling so that Jesus could heal him in chapter 2. We've watched as Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath in defiance of the religious elite in chapter 3. And then last Sunday in Mark 4, the chapter ended with the story of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Terror struck his followers, many of whom were veteran fishermen and experienced sailors. And they just looked around them and saw peril. They looked within and saw panic, and they failed to look to Jesus and find peace. But I think the message there is that even in the midst of the storm, they could have had faith in Jesus' plans, His presence, and His power, and so can we. And so that brings us to our passage for today. Mark 5 tells the story of a man possessed, a legion of demons, and a herd of suicidal pigs. It's a story that many of you may remember from Sunday school. But before we dig into this story, let me point out that the Bible treats demon possession as a very real issue. You know, this isn't just a man who was deranged or suffering from mental illness, or this encounter isn't just symbolic of evil in the world today. The Bible presents demon possession as a sober reality. Unfortunately, most Americans get their demonology from the 1973 cult classic, The Exorcist, or maybe from CW's wildly popular Supernatural. Neither one of which is very biblical in their presentation of how demons interact in the world. I like what C.S. Lewis wrote in the foreword to his satirical novel, though, The Screwtape Letters. He said, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about devils. One is to disbelieve their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight." And so with that thought in mind, if you have a Bible or maybe an app on your phone, go ahead and open it up to Mark chapter 5. And it begins with these words in the opening verses. Mark writes, "So they arrived at the other side of the lake." This is immediately following the storm on the Sea of Galilee. They arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from a cemetery to meet him. Now Matthew, in his account of this story, actually says that there are two demon-possessed men in this Gerasene graveyard. Mark focuses on the one doing all the talking. But as I see a progression in the rest of this passage that can be summed up in three words: destruction, deliverance, and deployment. These three words encapsulate the experience of these demon-possessed men. Of course, their ordeal begins with destruction. Now, I think today a lot of people aren't willing to give the devil his due. In fact, I read a story about a church where everything was going wonderfully Sunday morning. Everything was just smooth and a good worship experience until suddenly a flash of light and smoke appeared right in front of the pulpit, followed by a loud boom. And when the smoke cleared, the astonished congregation saw a red figure standing before them, including horns and a pointy tail and a red cape. And everybody, just screamed in panic. People crowded the doors to get out. Everyone was trampling over each other. And the devil just, he delighted with glee at everybody's retreat. But his mood changed by the sight of one man lounging comfortably in his pew. And Satan said, "Don't you know who I am?" And the man said, "Well, sure I do." And Satan seemed puzzled. He says, "Well, aren't you afraid of me?" And he said, "Nope." And then Satan stammered, "Why not?" The man snorted, "Well, I've been married to your sister for 35 years. Yeah, it's easy for us to make light of Satan when we have this mental picture of a caricature, the red skin and the horns and the pointy tail and all that. But what Mark describes here is no laughing matter. It's frightening if you think about it. He writes beginning in verse 3, This man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. It was still dark when they landed on the shore of the cemetery, and as soon as Jesus disembarked, this wild man comes running up to him. And this had to be an eerie experience for the disciples. Their nerves are already shot after the storm on the sea. And then this happens the instant they hit the shore. And Luke tells us that he didn't have any clothes on, that he was driven by the demons. He made his dwelling among the dead. He was defiled, depraved, desperate. Satan loves to distort and destroy the image of God within people. And that's just what he had done to this man. Satan had wrecked him, and society couldn't reform him. His problems couldn't be solved by social programs or psychologists. Self-help programs wouldn't work because he was self-harming. Nothing could restrain him. His lifestyle was destroying him. And he never stopped crying and cutting himself. In short, he was hopeless and helpless, isolated and empty, trapped and tormented, and he needed someone to intervene. But this is what Satan does in our lives, whether it's through possession or oppression or just a willing surrender to his influence. You see, it's not likely that any of us are ever going to be demon-possessed. It's just not as common as Sam and Dean Winchester would like to make it out to be. But I'm convinced that God allowed situations like this in an isolated part of the world during a brief period in human history just so that Jesus could demonstrate his power over Satan. Notice how the demons respond to seeing Jesus. Mark says in verse 7, with a shriek, he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" This was a shriek of fear and rebellion against Jesus. And just like this demon, I think there's a lot of people in our society screaming at God, screaming at the church, at Christian values. Why are you interfering with me? Just get out of my life. And when people reject Jesus and his authority, they put themselves on the side of demons. And the more we allow sin and Satan to get a foothold in our lives, the more destructive he can be. Never underestimate the destructive power of Satan. The Bible calls him in Revelation 9:11 the destroyer, because that's what he does best. And the worst part is that he usually gets us to destroy ourselves. The two men in the Garrison graveyard were no doubt extreme examples of what Satan could do, but he would do the same to each one of us if he had the opportunity. Thankfully, their story doesn't end here. Next, these demon-possessed men experienced deliverance. These demons instantly recognized Jesus, and they called him by name. They recognized him as the Son of God. And so Jesus responds by demanding to know the demon's name. And the demon replies in verse 9, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man." That's kind of creepy, isn't it? A Roman legion consisted of 6,000 highly trained soldiers, implying that there was an army of evil spirits inside of him. I can only imagine the anxiety and anguish they inflicted on him. It's no wonder that he cried out and cut himself night and day. But then something strange and revealing happens. In the second half of that verse we read, "And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area." Now again, in Luke's account we get a little more detail. He says that they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. Now, the abyss is described in Revelation as the deepest, darkest pit of Hades. The abyss is, according to Jude, a prison of darkness where demons await the day of judgment. And in Revelation 20, verse 3, we discover that Jesus has since locked and sealed the abyss until the day of judgment. The point is, these demons were terrified of Jesus. They knew they were outmatched the moment he set foot on shore. There's an entire army of evil spirits, and yet they cowered before Christ. They didn't prepare for battle. Rather, they just fell to their knees and begged for mercy. And this underscores the reality that even demons are not atheists or agnostics. I mean, as James says in James 2, verse 19, you believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. And I wonder if he had this very moment in mind when he wrote those words. This is where the story gets even stranger, though. Mark writes in verse 11 through 13, there happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. Send us into those pigs, the spirits begged. Let us enter them. So Jesus gave them permission. And the evil spirits came out of the man and entered the pigs. And the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. Now this passage raises a whole classroom full of questions. I mean, why did Jesus grant their request? Why did the pigs immediately, run off the cliff to their doom? What happened to the demons after the pigs drowned? Did they, find some other person to torment, or did they just wind up in the abyss anyway? And was this the first recorded case of deviled ham? Just asking. I know that was terrible, wasn't it? Sometimes I can't help myself. Whatever questions we might have, though, one thing is clear. Jesus demonstrated supreme authority and ability. These demons couldn't do anything without his permission. See, we make a mistake when we imagine Satan and Jesus as like equal and opposite forces. They aren't. Satan may seek our destruction, but Jesus brings deliverance. And as news spread, people from the nearby town and countryside rushed out to see what was happening. And Mark writes in verse 15 that a crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by a legion of demons. He was sitting there, fully clothed and perfectly sane. And they were all afraid. You put yourself in this man's shoes for just a moment, and for a long time, no telling how long, this man was driven by demons, dysfunctional, depressed, and a danger to himself and everyone else around him. But then he met Jesus, and everything changed. Through Jesus, he experienced deliverance, and Jesus still delivers. He still changes lives. It doesn't matter what demons you wrestle with, whether factual or just figurative demons, Jesus can set you free. Maybe you're wrestling with demons of abandonment or abuse or addiction. Maybe you face debt or divorce or drunkenness or depression. You've got bills you can't pay and grades you can't make and people you can't please, whiskey you can't resist, pornography you can't refuse, a career you can't escape, a past you can't shake, a future you can't face. And the reality is, by ourselves, we aren't strong enough to defeat our demons. But a whole legion of demons trembled at the sight of Jesus and fled at his command. He delivered these two demoniacs in a seaside cemetery, and he can deliver us too. And finally, undergoing destruction and deliverance, these once possessed men then enjoyed deployment. After what had happened, the townspeople kind of panicked. I mean, they could handle two demon-possessed men living out in a cemetery, kind of isolated and away from everybody else. But a man that can cast out demons and drive a herd of pigs into the sea, that freaked them out. And they weren't sure how to handle it. They didn't know what to do with Jesus. And so the crowd pleaded with Jesus to just go away, to just leave their little community alone. And being the gentleman that he is, Jesus respected their wishes. And then we read in verse 18 through 20, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, no, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been. So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him. and everyone was amazed at what he told them. You know, it interested me that Jesus honored the requests of the people to be left alone, but he denied the requests of the disciple that wanted to be with him. I think it's because Jesus had a greater purpose for him, though. Jesus sent him out on deployment, a man on a mission. He had a story to tell, probably the greatest, most dramatic before and after story ever. And he would be more effective sharing his story at home than out on the road with Jesus. I mean, think about that. If he went with Jesus and he shared this story about having been demon-possessed and Jesus, set him free with strangers, then they could easily dismiss him as a liar or a lunatic. But if he went home to his own family and friends and neighbors, people who knew him and knew what he was like before, and told them about Jesus, those people would be amazed and more apt to believe. He could reach a whole community with the message of God's goodness and grace where previously Jesus wasn't welcomed. The 10 towns became his mission field. No one is ever saved to sit. Once you're saved, you have a story to tell. And those before and after stories, people love them. I mean, somebody loses 100 pounds or maybe you've got somebody who was an alcoholic and his life was just a wreck, and then, now he's got his life together and he's clean and sober. Everybody always wants to know, how did you do it? It's the same question. It doesn't matter what the situation is. The question is, how'd you do it? And for this man, the answer was Jesus. And for you and me, the answer is Jesus. The question is, what am I doing to expand God's kingdom? What has Jesus done in my life that's worth sharing with someone else? And who am I able to share my story with that maybe nobody else can reach? You may not be a Bible scholar or an apologist, but you're an authority on your own life. Maybe a lot of people who won't read the Bible or set foot in a church or sit through a sermon will listen to an honest personal story. And by sharing your own before and after story, you build a bridge that Jesus can walk across from your heart to someone else's. Like these demon-possessed men, anyone who's experienced the ravages of sin knows how destructive Satan can be. But like them, we can experience deliverance through Jesus. It may not be as immediate or dramatic as it was for these men. Some things take time to heal and recover from. But Jesus can set us free from a life of sin and self-destruction. And then we too need to deploy into our own communities, our own families, and share what Jesus has done in our lives. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Next week, we'll continue on through the Gospel of Mark. But in the meantime, if you're ready to put your faith in Jesus and to begin a lifelong journey of following in His steps, let me invite you to come forward and share that with us while we stand and sing together.